The driveway was slick with the heat of a July afternoon, but as Arthur turned the corner toward the house, he froze. His heart didn't just skip a beat, it dropped into his stomach. There he was, tender-hearted Leo, standing behind a wobbly card table in the blazing sun. Spread out before him were the things that defined his childhood: the vintage wooden train set, the limited edition action figures, and the telescope they had saved 3 months to buy together. Arthur didn't think, he just reacted. "Leo!" he barked, his voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and raw, biting shame. Leo jumped, his small hands trembling as he shoved a handful of crumpled bills into his pockets. Arthur marched across the asphalt, his boots heavy, his frustration boiling over. To see his son selling his treasures, their shared memories, to a group of indifferent strangers, felt like a public indictment of his failures as a father. Arthur reached the table, grabbing the arm of the hand-carved train engine before a neighbor could snap it up. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "These aren't yours to sell. Do you have any idea what these meant to us?" Leo didn't look at him, his chin tucked into his chest, his shoulders shaking with a silence that terrified Arthur more than any outburst. He didn't defend himself. He didn't cry. He just let Arthur pull the remaining items from the table, dragging him toward the house, while the neighbors whispered behind their backs. Arthur was convinced this was a reckless act of defiance. He was wrong, and when he finally saw the truth, it broke him in a way he would never recover from. Once they were inside the quiet, dim kitchen, the silence was heavy. Arthur pointed to the floor. "Empty your pockets, Leo. All of them." Leo slowly pulled out the cash. It wasn't much, mostly crumpled singles and loose quarters, but it represented every toy he had ever loved. Arthur's chest tightened. He felt like a failure. At 55, he was already tired, his back always aching from his shift at the warehouse, his bank account always showing a balance that made him nervous. He thought his son was trying to be grown up by getting rid of his childhood, or worse, that he was trying to buy something foolish. "We don't sell our history," Arthur said, his voice finally losing some of its edge, replaced by a dull, aching sadness. "These things, they are all we have left of the good times." Leo finally looked up. His eyes were wide and glossy, but he didn't say a word. He turned and ran toward his bedroom, the door clicking shut behind him with a soft, final sound. Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. He felt a deep, stinging regret for how he had shouted in front of the neighbors. He needed to apologize. He walked down the hallway, intending to knock, but the door was already slightly ajar. He pushed it open just enough to peek in. Leo was sitting on his bed, his back to the door, staring at the empty space on his shelf, where his toys used to be. Arthur stepped inside. He saw a small, blue notebook lying open on the mattress. Next to it was a torn piece of paper, the back of a grocery receipt. Arthur picked up the paper. His heart stopped. It was a list. In his son's messy, boyish handwriting, he had written 1. Dad's medicine refill $42 2. Rent, the extra he needs, $100. 3. Fix Dad's work boots so he doesn't have to walk on his toes, $35. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. He walked over to the desk, and there, peeking out from under a stack of school books, was an eviction notice. It was a letter from the landlord that Arthur had hidden away weeks ago, thinking he had safely tucked it out of sight. But Leo had found it. The boy hadn't been selling his toys to be reckless. He hadn't been trying to grow up too fast or be difficult. He had been looking at his father's tired face every night. He had noticed Arthur limping when he walked, because the soles of his boots were worn thin. He had overheard the phone calls with the landlord. Leo had decided that his toys were worth nothing if they couldn't help the person he loved most. The sacrifice was not a burden to him, it was a mission. He had spent hours organizing the sale, carefully pricing the items based on what he thought people would pay, his little brow furrowed in concentration. He had even practiced a sales pitch, trying to sound professional so no one would ask why a child was selling his life's work. Every dollar earned felt like a small victory against the monster of debt that was slowly eating their home. Arthur realized then that his son had been observing his silent struggles with a maturity far beyond his 10 years, quietly plotting how to step into the gap and protect the only family he had. Arthur dropped the paper. He fell to his knees beside the bed. The weight of his own pride, the weight of his struggle, and the overwhelming, terrifying realization of his son's love crashed down on him. He reached out and turned Leo around. The boy wasn't angry. He was just worried. "Dad?" Leo whispered, his voice small. "I'm sorry I sold them. I wanted to make sure we didn't have to leave." Arthur couldn't speak. Every time he tried to form a word, a sob caught in his throat. He pulled his son into his arms and held him so tight it felt like he was trying to protect him from the entire world. In that moment, Arthur understood something profound. He had spent his whole life trying to provide things for his son: toys, clothes, a roof. He had measured his worth as a father by the items he could buy. But he had been looking at it all wrong. The greatest thing he had ever bought wasn't a toy or a house. It was the heart of the boy standing right there. "You don't have to do this, Leo," Arthur finally managed to choke out, his tears falling onto the boy's shoulder. "You are just a kid. You shouldn't have to carry these kinds of burdens." "But you're my dad," Leo said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "And we're a team, right?" That word, team, hit Arthur harder than anything. For years, he had felt like he was fighting this war alone, hidden behind his own stubborn pride. He had been so busy trying to be a provider that he had forgotten to be a partner. They spent the rest of the evening together, not talking about the toys or the money or the stress. They sat on the floor of the bedroom and started putting the remaining items back on the shelves, one by one. The next morning, Arthur didn't go back to the warehouse. Instead, he took the money Leo had made, added every cent he had in his own wallet, and they walked to the store together. They didn't buy new toys. Arthur bought a new pair of insoles for his boots, just to show Leo he was listening. Then he bought a new, sturdy notebook. "From now on," Arthur said, handing the notebook to his son, "we write down our problems together. We don't hide them, and we don't sell our joy to pay for the bad times." Leo smiled, a real, wide smile that Arthur hadn't seen in months. They were still poor, and the bills were still waiting, but for the first time in his life, Arthur didn't feel like a failed father. He felt like a man who had been given the greatest gift of all, a partner who would stand by him, even when the world got hard. He looked at the empty spaces on the shelf where the toys had been, and he didn't feel sad anymore. He realized those spaces were just reminders of how much his son loved him, and that was a treasure that would last long after all the toys were gone. As the sun set, they sat on the front porch. The neighborhood was quiet. Arthur put his arm around his son, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt completely, perfectly at peace. He finally understood that being a father wasn't about being perfect, or being rich, or having all the answers. It was about standing together, side by side, when the storms came. And as long as he had Leo, Arthur knew they would find a way through anything. He was no longer speechless. He had a million things to tell his son, but for now, a simple hug was enough to say everything that needed to be said.